Weep away my pain, bring your healing to my heart, help me love once again. Cares and worries get me down, fear of failure fills my day. When I'm lost and all alone, help me, Lord, to find your way. People knocking at my door, strangers seeking love and care. Never let me turn them down. Teach me gently how to share. Children, come into my life with your laughter and your song. When will I become like them? Teach me, Lord, to sing along.
Dear friends, welcome back to our Bible reflection session. Last day we were reflecting on chapter 50 of 2nd Isaiah and the third servant song we are trying to understand. Okay, now we have already seen there is gradually a revelation or the revelatory process going progressive. In the first one we have seen, the servant of God is called, entrusted with a mission, and that mission is to save the people of God. And the second one we see, God made the servant or servant's mouth sharp like a sword and his tongue like a polished arrow, so that he can convey the message of God to sustain the weary. And when we come to the third song, we find God makes him suffer for the sins of others. And God has awakened him day after day, whispered in his ear that he should not rebel and he should not run away. But in the opposite, he should endure suffering. And to what extent? He is to show his back to those who beat him, show his cheek to those who pull out the beard, show his face for insulting or for being insulted, and again, not to hide the face from spitting. And therefore we find the servant is persecuted to such an extent that he is both physically and interiorly persecuted and crushed. Yet the servant always trusted in the Lord. He hoped that Yahweh would come to vindicate him. And therefore we see the revelation about the servant of God is gradually progressive in idea and in depth. Also in the meaning of the suffering of the innocent goes through this kind of updation. And now we come to the fourth servant song. And we can say that here the main thrust, of course, the servant song is chapter 52 verses 13 up to chapter 53 to verses 12. And here we find the servant is being exalted after the suffering. Therefore, the emphasis or the thrust is on suffering. The exaltation after the suffering. Here, suffering is narrated in great deal, but exaltation becomes more prominent and gets emphasized. And we can also see that in the beginning and in the end, both passages speak of the exaltation of the servant who has suffered a lot. God has exalted him, and that is what you would say. And the servant is glorified. Of course, it does not say that servant is glorified just by suffering. But more than that, the servant obeyed totally the will of God and committed himself totally to the mission entrusted. And hence, God exalted him. And this is what we can see here. Both the beginning and the end verses reveal that it is the work of Yahweh. Chapter 52 verses 13 to 15 and chapter 53 verses 11 to 12 reveal this. And when we go through the text, we find different characters here playing a role. There is a servant. Then there are the people who watch what happens to the servant, and they are called they. And the they stands for Israelites. And today we can say, for example, we are the people who are meant by they, because today we reflect on that passage. Hence, practically, they means we, or the men of today, the generation of today. And that would mean the servant suffered and died for our sake, for the present generation too. And this is what we can say. And when we go through the 4 songs, we have received an idea about the servant of God, Yebeth Yahweh. Yebeth, of course, would mean the servant. And Yebeth Yahweh, the story is coming to a conclusion here in chapter 53. And what are the impressions that we get here? We can mention it like this. First of all, when the scene begins, there are the outsiders. They are just there to watch, but they don't understand. And they found no beauty, no form in the servant who was beaten up, was crushed. But they don't feel anything. Then In the second stage, we find the same people. They begin to think. They ponder over what they have seen. And now they come to realize gradually that he is suffering for their own sins. It's a terrible understanding. The servant is without blame or sin. Then why should he suffer? If he suffers, it is because of the sins of others. People come to grip with this reality. Then they reflect again and they come to realize the meaning of his suffering through the revelations given to them. And the meaning of his suffering is really a vicarious suffering. That is, one suffers for the sake of another one. And vicarious suffering means one suffers and dies for others. Remember the words spoken by the high priest Caiaphas. It is better that one dies rather than the entire nation perishes. This is actually the vicarious suffering. One suffers for the sake of others. And again, why this vicarious suffering? And now they come to realize that he is the one who carries their sins and iniquities. And he suffers at an attonishment, he suffers the punishment as an atonement. Therefore, we see the vicarious suffering. It is for the sins of others. And what is the advantage of this suffering? And there we can see, through his suffering, the people are healed and they are made whole. And hence, they are freed from the sicknesses. And who is it that makes the servant suffer like this? Revelation now teaches that it is the will of God. And why? God has made him a sin offering for the people of Israel and for the entire people of the world. He is a sin offering. And even when the servant suffers, we see he is patient and silent. Normally we know if somebody is made to suffer, they'll be crying aloud. And when they are made to suffer unjustly, without having committed any crime or sin, naturally they will be lamenting. But here, nothing of the sort occurs. He is enduring the suffering very patiently, very silently. And what does it mean? This suffering in silence and patience does not mean the servant is weak. Servant is not strong. Or the servant is indifferent. But it is just opposite. The suffering when one is innocent makes one all the more stronger. And his patience will have very great motivating power, you can say. And therefore, he is suffering with patience and silence. And now we see the author has tried to bring out the concept of the suffering of the servant about Yahweh in his best sense. And the suffering endured by the servant surpasses or transcends all measures which are usually given as punishment for sin, iniquity, and the like. Thus we see the servant has acquired a very great value in that suffering. And this is in sum total the features that we find here. Now we shall look at the text. The first part, chapter 52, verses 13 to 15. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marked was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths before him, because of him. For that which had not been told them, they shall see, and that which they had not heard, they shall contemplate. Okay, the suffering of the servant is very, very peculiar. He has gone beyond all measures. And when somebody is suffering in such a way, naturally, it is not just for the sake of suffering, but with an ulterior motive. And the people have understood it practically. Therefore, this is what we can say. And thus, we see in the first part, God is exalting the suffering, the servant. It is true he suffers, but that suffering leads to exaltation, glorification. And therefore, it is very clear that God is playing his role in a hidden way. And that's what we can understand. Therefore, the exaltation is the result of going through suffering and humiliation, not the other way. Therefore, this suffering has a great meaning for their life. And now we go to chapter 53, and there we find, first of all, a description about his suffering, a report of his suffering. Verses 53, chapter 53, verses 1 to 11. And just as in a psalm, the sufferings are narrated stage by stage. And the important words that we find here in verse 2 and 3, we find verse 2, for he grew up before him. Grew up. Therefore, the servant is reared by the master, and he grew up. Then he is persecuted. Verses 4 and 5. And he suffers everything like a sheep for a slaughter. And that is what we find in verse 7, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. And then what happens in verse 8? He is killed and buried. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich. And thus we find he was killed. In verse 8 we read, he was cut off from the land of the living. And now we see it is a vicarious suffering for our sins. And that is what we see. It was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. And therefore, in verse 10, we further read, when you make his life an offering for sin, therefore he has offered his life in atonement for their sins. And thus we see the revelation given about the servant and about his suffering is really having a progressive nature. It is the ascending and in a progressive manner. But as it goes up, we can see the degree changes for the superlative. That's what we can say. His suffering increases and finally he is to die. Therefore, that is the way the story is narrated. And in this chapter 53, we find a great revelation that is made about the meaning of the suffering of the servant. It is not like the suffering of other people. They may have different reasons for their suffering. But here, this particular servant suffers for no cause of his own, but for the sake of others. And it is narrated in chapter 53. Now we shall go through just through these verses and see what is the opinion of the people about him. In verse 53, chapter 53, we read, who has believed what we heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Okay, because of the suffering, his external appearance has totally changed. First of all, there is nothing desirous to see in him. And he has lost even his human form. There is nothing that attracts us in him. He has been suffering and he suffered a lot. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. When somebody is wounded terribly, we don't feel like looking at him. He has lost practically the human form. He's disfigured. And that practically makes us look away from him. And therefore it is said, there is nothing desirous in him. He has lost his human form, his attractiveness, everything is lost. He is just a person full of wounds and bleeding. And when we look at such a person, it is a kind of restlessness, or we can say an inner restlessness that comes into our mind. How can somebody do these things to such a person? And that is why it is said, even the human form is not there. And therefore we see the intensity and the volume of the suffering he underwent. It was so terrible, and that is what's said. Okay, therefore the intensity of his suffering is brought out here. And then in verse 3, we read again. What was the kind of suffering he went through? He was despised and rejected by others. We know these things, rejection, despisal, they cause the interior suffering very severe. And now the people look at him and they don't find anything desirous in him, and hence they despise him. And not only that, they reject him. Therefore, the people, the onlookers, they are having their own way of imagination. And the servant is rejected by them. He is despised by them. And then it said, a man of suffering, and that is why he is despised and acquainted with the infirmity. We know, when somebody's body is totally wounded and full of blood, we don't want to look at such a person for long. We can't. The same way here. The people find him a man of suffering and full of infirmity. Therefore, he is suffering of infirmity and also suffering due to the torture. And now we see, they thought of him as he is considered by the people as one who is a sinner. And this concept has a very important meaning to be understood. According to the people, or according to the theology of the time, we can say, a person will have to suffer if he commits sin. And if somebody commits sin, then naturally he will be persecuted. And hence, If somebody is suffering, clear indication is that the person who suffers is a sinner. Maybe that the sin is not known publicly. In that case, he is a sinner in secret. And that was the thought pattern of the time. If the servant is suffering, it is just because he has done something wrong. And for his wrong, God has aptly punished him. That is the usual way or usual concept. But at the same time, when one is made to suffer in this way, they thought that God has struck down him for his own sins. They cannot think otherwise. Okay, just take the example of the great man Job. God was testing him, but Job did not understand it. And therefore what happens? The people, the theologians of the time, and everybody, they came and told him that he is just a sinner. If there was no sin in him, God would not have punished him. That is what they say. And therefore they assume that since Job is being punished, he has committed sin. And that is more painful than suffering itself, to be accused baselessly that he is suffering for his sins which he has not done at all. And here, what did the people looking around, or the onlookers, they think of him? They now think that this person is suffering so much. The reason is he might have done something wrong. And God, who sees the heart, repays as one is worthy for it. And hence they all think that he has done something wrong, and for his wrong he is being punished. Therefore, what do you find here actually? That is a common method of reasoning. When we look around ourselves, we see the same today. If somebody is suffering greatly, our first question, why God has done this to this particular person? And then we begin to think, maybe God is punishing that person for something that he has done, which we do not know. Therefore, the suffering of the servant was considered first by the onlookers, by the common people, as the result of his serious sin, which he has committed either knowingly or unknowingly. But God, who sees the heart, is punishing him. That is what the people think. And this is what the friends of Job said to him. And from this, what can we infer? The servant has done nothing wrong. Still, he was to suffer. And that suffering was not something simple, just terrific. But still, he went on. And that endurance in suffering makes his life more meritorious before God. And that is what we can see. Okay, hereby we close today's session, and we'll continue with chapter 53 tomorrow. And as I said earlier, kindly go through this text and read them meditatively, prayerfully. They contain a vast variety of knowledge. And not only that, the meaning of our salvation, how we came to achieve it. All these things are narrated there. Therefore, let us try to go through the text as many times as possible, we can say. Okay, see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Loving God, we thank you for the blessing of reading your word together. We ask that these words of life, truth, and hope would continue to impact us in the days ahead. May your love and grace follow each of us, refreshed and blessed by you. Amen.